Iran is in the news every single week. Nuclear negotiations collapsing, drone shipments intercepted, Revolutionary Guard units moving toward proxy battlefields, satellite images of facilities that weren't there a month ago, threats issued in formal government language, with the weight of military action behind them. The Middle East holds its breath, and the whole world watches. But here is what almost no one in those newsrooms knows, what almost no analyst mentions, what the cable networks never say. Iran's story was not written in the last century. It was not written when the Islamic Revolution overthrew the Shah in 1979. It was not written when Israel was declared a state in 1948. It was written in the Bible, all of it. The rise, the fall, the role as liberator, the role as threat, the coming judgment, and something even more unexpected, a promise of restoration that has never been canceled. From the first book of the Bible to the last, from Genesis to Revelation, the nation we call Iran appears in prophecy under its ancient name, Persia, and under its oldest name, Elam. It appears as a military power, as a deliverer of God's people, as a stage for one of Scripture's most dramatic rescue stories, and as a participant in the final global confrontation before the end of the age. No other nation outside Israel itself travels such a complete arc through the pages of Scripture. And here's the most remarkable thing. Not a single one of the major biblical prophecies about this nation was written after the fact. Every key prediction was recorded before the events occurred, some of them centuries before. One of them named a specific king of Persia by his personal name, more than 150 years before that king was even born. If that does not make you want to keep listening, I don't know what will. Stay with me. We are going all the way from the beginning to the end. And by the time we are done, you will understand what is happening in Iran in a way that no news broadcast will ever tell you. Before there was an Iran, before there was a Persia, before any empire had claimed that vast plateau between the Zagros Mountains and the Persian Gulf, there were two men. Their names appear in the 10th chapter of Genesis, in the great genealogy that traces the repopulation of the earth after the flood. Two names that most people skip over without a second glance: Madai and Elam. Madai was the son of Japheth, one of Noah's 3 sons. His descendants settled in the mountainous northern regions of what we now call Iran. They were a highland people, tough and organized, who would eventually become known by another name: the Medes. Elam was the son of Shem, another of Noah's sons. His descendants established themselves in the fertile southwestern plains near the Persian Gulf, in a region that bore his name for centuries: Elam. Their capital city, Susa, would one day become one of the most famous cities in the ancient world. Two family lines, one settled in the mountains, one in the plains. The same territory, centuries apart in prominence. This is where Iran's story begins. Not with a revolution, not with the discovery of oil, not with a political movement of any kind. Iran's story begins in the family tree of Noah, in the pages of the oldest book in the world, in the very first chapter of God's dealings with the nations after the flood. The Medes and the Elamites would eventually come together to form something the ancient world had never seen before. But that comes later. First, there was a war. Genesis chapter 14 is one of the most significant and under-examined chapters in the entire Old Testament. It records the first international military conflict described in Scripture. A coalition of 4 eastern kings invaded the region of Canaan, pressing through the Jordan Valley, destroying city after city, enslaving populations, and taking prisoners as they went. The leader of that eastern coalition was Chedorlaomer, king of Elam. Elam, the same nation, the same people we just met in the genealogy of Noah. Within the first 14 chapters of the Bible, Elam had already emerged as a major military power, capable of organizing a multi-nation coalition and pushing it hundreds of miles from its own territory into the land where God had placed Abraham. Among the prisoners taken in that campaign was Lot, Abraham's nephew. And Abraham did something that no one at the time would have predicted. He gathered his trained fighting men, 318 of them, and pursued the coalition through the night. He caught up with them at Dan, near the northern edge of Canaan, attacked by night, and drove them all the way to the region near Damascus. Lot was rescued. The prisoners were freed. The eastern kings, including the king of Elam, were turned back by a man with no army, no kingdom, and no military alliance to speak of. The message in that story is the same message that will echo through every other chapter of Iran's biblical history. Power alone, no matter how impressive, runs into a wall when it moves against the people God has placed under his protection. But Elam did not disappear after that defeat. It regrouped. It grew. Centuries would pass, and the nation that had been sent back by 300 men would return as something far larger. Now, here is where it gets extraordinary, because the next time Persia appears in a major biblical moment, it is not as an enemy. It is as an instrument, and it is prophesied long before it happens. At some point in the 8th century before Christ, the prophet Isaiah received a vision. He wrote it down. Scribes copied it. It was preserved and passed through generations. And in that vision, Isaiah did something that had no precedent in the history of prophetic literature. He named a foreign king by his personal name, before that king was born, before his parents gave him that name, before the kingdom he would one day rule even existed in its final form. The name was Cyrus. Isaiah wrote, speaking as the voice of God, "I am the one who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he will accomplish everything I intend. He will say of Jerusalem, let it be rebuilt, and of the temple, let its foundation be laid." When Isaiah wrote those words, the city of Jerusalem was still standing. The temple was still intact. The Babylonian Empire had not yet risen to the point where it would one day destroy both. And the Persian Empire, which Cyrus would eventually lead, was still a collection of highland tribes with no unified kingdom and no king named Cyrus anywhere in their history. More than 150 years after Isaiah put those words in writing, a child was born in Persia. His parents named him Cyrus. He grew up. He conquered Media and united the two peoples, Medes and Persians, into a single empire. He turned that empire into the greatest military and political force in the ancient world. And then he did exactly what Isaiah said he would do, more than a century and a half before his birth. We will get to what he actually did in a moment. First, let us follow the prophecy to where it came from, because there was another man who watched all of this unfold from inside the very empire that Cyrus was destined to replace. Daniel was a teenager when everything he had ever known was taken from him. The Babylonian army, under King Nebuchadnezzar, broke through the walls of Jerusalem in 605 BC. The temple was stripped. The royal household was captured. And among the young men selected for service in the Babylonian court was a boy from a prominent Jewish family named Daniel. He would spend the rest of his life in the empire that had destroyed his home. But God gave Daniel something that no Babylonian official could explain or replicate: the ability to understand visions and to interpret dreams with precision that consistently proved accurate. The king himself came to Daniel first. Nebuchadnezzar had been disturbed by a dream so vivid and troubling that he called in every interpreter and wise man in Babylon, not to interpret the dream, but to first tell him what the dream was, without being informed of it. No one could do this. Daniel could. The dream was of a towering statue, brilliant and terrifying. The head was gold. The chest and arms were silver. The belly and thighs were bronze. The legs were iron, and the feet were a mixture of iron and clay. A stone struck the statue at its feet and destroyed the entire structure, after which the stone grew into a mountain that filled the whole earth. Daniel explained, "You, O king, are the head of gold. Your kingdom is the greatest now existing. But after you, another kingdom will rise, and then another after that." The chest of silver, Daniel said, represented the kingdom that would follow Babylon. At the time Daniel said this, that kingdom did not yet exist in any form that could threaten Babylon. But within decades, the empire of the Medes and Persians would rise from the highlands of Iran, absorb the power of Media under the unified vision of Cyrus, and position itself to do the very thing Daniel had announced. The Silver Kingdom was Persia, and God had shown its arrival to a captive Jewish teenager in the capital of the empire that Persia would eventually swallow whole. The story of Babylon's fall is one of the most precisely documented moments in all of ancient history, and it happened exactly the way two separate prophets had said it would, decades before it occurred. King Belshazzar was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. On the night in question, he held a feast for 1,000 of his nobles. This was not unusual. What he did next was, in a gesture of contempt or carelessness that is difficult to fully explain, Belshazzar ordered the gold and silver vessels that his grandfather had taken from the Jewish temple in Jerusalem to be brought out. He wanted to drink from them. His guests, his wives, his concubines, they all raised those sacred cups together and offered praise to gods made of gold and silver and bronze and stone. At that moment, a human hand appeared on the wall, just a hand, with no body attached to it, and it wrote 4 words in the plaster of the palace wall. The king's face went white. His legs gave out beneath him. He called for every interpreter in Babylon. No one could read what had been written. Daniel was brought in. He read the inscription, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin, and he explained what it meant. Your days have been numbered, and your reign is finished. You have been weighed and found wanting. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. That same night, the army of Cyrus the Great was positioned outside the walls of Babylon. They had already solved the engineering problem that should have made the city impregnable. The Euphrates River ran directly under the city walls. Cyrus diverted the river upstream. The water level dropped. His soldiers walked in through the riverbed, under the walls, directly into the city. The gates had been left open. Belshazzar was killed before morning. The Babylonian Empire, which had stood for generations, fell between the moment Daniel finished speaking and the appearance of the first light of day. The silver arms of the statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream had risen exactly where Daniel had said they would. And now something happened that no one expected. Something so surprising that you almost have to read it twice to believe it is there. Persia did not do what conquering empires did. Every other empire that had ever rolled over the Jewish people had one policy for managing conquered populations: subjugation, forced labor, displacement, and the systematic erasure of cultural and religious identity. Assyria had exported entire populations. Babylon had done the same. The pattern was clear, consistent, and brutal. Cyrus broke the pattern entirely. Within the first year of his rule over Babylon, he issued an edict. The Jewish people who had been living in exile since Nebuchadnezzar carried them away were free to return to their homeland. Not only were they free to go, Cyrus funded the project. He returned the temple vessels that Belshazzar had been drinking from on the night he died. He authorized the rebuilding of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. He sent back the Jewish leadership, including a man named Zerubbabel, from the royal line of David, and a high priest named Jeshua to lead the restoration effort. The prophet Jeremiah had said the exile would last 70 years. It lasted approximately 70 years. Isaiah had said Cyrus would be God's shepherd, that he would say of Jerusalem, "Let it be rebuilt." Cyrus said exactly that. A pagan king, who worshipped gods other than the God of Israel, became the instrument through which 70 years of prophetic promise were fulfilled, through which a people carried into captivity by the most powerful empire in the world were set free, through which the holy city of Jerusalem began its long restoration. There is a verse in Isaiah where God speaks to Cyrus directly, even though Cyrus did not know him. God says, "I will strengthen you, even though you have not acknowledged me, so that from the rising of the sun to its setting, people may know there is no one besides me." The liberation of Israel through Persia was not coincidence. It was announcement. God was showing the watching world that he governs the movements of empires, even the empires that do not know his name. And Daniel was watching all of this unfold because his visions were not finished. Daniel's second great vision came years after the statue dream. This time, the imagery was different. Instead of metals, he saw animals emerging from a stormy sea. The second animal was a bear. It was raised up on one side, as if leaning, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth. A voice commanded it, "Get up and eat your fill." The angel who interpreted the vision for Daniel was direct. This bear is the Medo-Persian Empire. The lopsided posture of the bear, raised on one side, represented the fact that, although the empire was built on the partnership of two peoples, one was dominant. Persia rose above Media and held the real power. The three ribs in its mouth represented three major kingdoms that Persia would consume: Lydia, Babylon, and Egypt. History records all three in sequence. Cyrus conquered Lydia in Western Asia Minor, ending the reign of King Croesus, one of the wealthiest rulers in the ancient world. Then Cyrus took Babylon, as we have already seen. Then Cambyses, the son of Cyrus, led Persian forces across the Sinai Desert and defeated Egypt at the Battle of Pelusium. The ancient oppressor of Israel, the empire that had enslaved God's people for 400 years, fell to the successors of the nation that had freed them. The three ribs. Daniel saw this before any of it happened. Then came a third vision, even more specific. Daniel saw a ram with two uneven horns, the taller one growing up later than the first. The ram charged in every direction, and nothing could stand against it. The angel explained, the ram with the two horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. The taller horn, the one that rose later, is Persia itself. Then a goat appeared from the west, moving so fast its feet did not seem to touch the ground. It had one great horn between its eyes, and it struck the ram, broke both its horns, and trampled it. The angel explained, the goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn is the first king. Persia, for all its power, would eventually meet something faster and more destructive than itself. History records this, too. Alexander the Great moved through the Persian Empire at a pace that ancient sources describe, with almost the same language Daniel used. His speed was legendary. He broke the Persian Empire at 3 major battles in 11 years. Daniel saw the rise and fall of Persia from inside Babylon, before Persia had even risen. But before Persia fell to Greece, something happened inside the empire that would have destroyed the Jewish people entirely, if not for one woman who should never have had the power she had. The city of Susa was Persia's winter capital, located in the southwestern Iranian plains that once belonged to ancient Elam. It was in Susa that the throne of the Persian Empire sat during the reign of King Ahasuerus, known in Greek sources as Xerxes. He ruled over 127 provinces, from India to Ethiopia. The empire at its height was larger than any political entity that had existed before it. In that palace lived a young Jewish woman who had grown up as an orphan in the empire's diaspora communities. She had been raised by her older cousin Mordecai after her parents died. Her Hebrew name was Hadassah, but in the palace, she was known by her Persian name, Esther. When the previous queen, Vashti, was removed from her position after refusing a public command from the king, the search for a new queen spread across the entire empire. The most promising young women from every province were brought to Susa for a year of preparation before being presented to the king. Esther was among them. The text says she won favor with everyone who saw her. When the king saw her, he chose her as queen without knowing she was Jewish, without knowing her background, without knowing that the choice he was making was not his alone. Meanwhile, in the palace, a man named Haman had risen to the highest position in the government, beneath the king himself. He was a descendant of Agag, king of the Amalekites, Israel's ancient enemy. Everyone in the palace bowed to Haman when he passed. Everyone except Mordecai. Mordecai was Jewish. He would not bow to Haman, and he gave no explanation that satisfied anyone who asked. When Haman learned who Mordecai was and why he refused, his anger was not limited to one man. He looked at the scope of his own power and decided to use it in the most comprehensive way possible. He went to the king with a proposal. There is a people scattered throughout the empire, with customs different from everyone else, and who do not obey the king's laws. It would be in the king's interest to issue a decree for their elimination. Haman would personally cover the financial cost of the operation. The king gave him his signet ring. The decree was issued and sealed. A date was set. On a single day, 1 year away, every Jewish person in the Persian Empire, men, women, and children, would be put to death. Within a single afternoon, the entire Jewish people had been sentenced to annihilation inside the most powerful empire on earth, and no one knew the queen was one of them. When Mordecai sent word to Esther about the decree, she responded with what was, from a purely practical standpoint, a very reasonable concern. Anyone who entered the king's presence without being summoned was to be put to death. This was Persian law. The only exception was if the king extended his golden scepter. She had not been called to the king's presence for 30 days. Mordecai's response to her hesitation is one of the most famous lines in all of Hebrew scripture. He told her that she should not imagine that being inside the palace would protect her when the decree fell. And then who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Esther made her decision. She asked all the Jews in Susa to fast for 3 days on her behalf. Then she went in to the king. The king saw her. He extended the scepter. She had survived the entrance, but she did not speak immediately. She invited the king and Haman to a private banquet, and then to another one. It was at the second banquet that she made her case. She told the king that she and her people had been sentenced to death. The king demanded to know who had authorized such a thing. Esther pointed directly at Haman. Haman fell to his knees before the queen, pleading for his life. When the king returned and found him in that position, the situation became even worse for Haman than it had been. He was executed on the very platform he had built to execute Mordecai. But the original decree could not simply be cancelled under Persian law. A royal decree was irrevocable once issued. So Esther and Mordecai brought a second proposal. Issue a second decree, authorizing the Jewish people throughout the empire to organize and defend themselves against anyone who tried to carry out the first decree. The king authorized it. The second decree was sent throughout the empire at the fastest speed the postal system could manage. On the day that had been designated for the destruction of the Jewish people, something different happened. The people who had planned to carry out the first decree found themselves facing organized Jewish communities who had been given royal authorization to fight back. What was designed as a genocide became a day of Jewish survival and victory. The most powerful empire in the ancient world, with the full force of a royal decree behind it, could not eliminate the people God had promised to preserve. And the instrument God chose to prevent it was an orphan girl who had no political credentials, no military force, and no right to enter the throne room. Persia had freed Israel from Babylon. Now Persia had again become the stage where Jewish survival was preserved. The nation born from Elam and Madai had twice become an instrument in God's hands for the protection of his people. But there was one more role for Persia to play before its ancient chapter closed. When Matthew's Gospel opens the account of Jesus' birth, it mentions something that most readers pass over too quickly. Wise men came from the east, following a star. They came to Jerusalem, asking where they could find the one who had been born King of the Jews. Their confidence was complete. They were not searching uncertainly. They had seen something in the sky that they recognized, and they knew what it meant. Who were these men? Matthew uses the word magi. This was not a vague term. In the ancient world, Magi were a specific class of scholars and advisors associated with the royal courts of the regions east of Judea. Their traditions of astronomical observation and prophetic study were particularly well developed in the region that had been the heart of the Persian Empire. The most likely location of their origin was the former Persian territory, the region of ancient Elam and Media, the same land that is now Iran. If these men were students of the ancient Persian scholarly tradition, they would have had access to a body of literature that most other scholars in the ancient world never encountered, including the writings of a Hebrew prophet who had served in the courts of both Babylon and Persia, who had received visions of world history from Genesis to the end of the age. Daniel had done something in his visions that went beyond describing which empires would rise and fall. In his 9th chapter, he laid out a specific prophetic timeline. He calculated, from the moment of a particular royal decree, the number of years until the arrival of the Anointed One, the Messiah. If the Magi knew Daniel's calculation, and if they were the kind of rigorous scholars their reputation suggests, they would have known the time was near. And when an unusual star appeared in the sky, they would have understood it not as an ordinary astronomical event, but as the signal that the calculation had reached its end. They arrived at the court of Herod in Jerusalem, asking to honor the newborn king. Herod's own scholars and religious leaders, the people who should have known Daniel's timeline better than anyone, had not followed the star, had not made the trip. The first visitors to honor the Jewish Messiah, from outside the family of Israel, came from Persia, from the land of Elam and Madai, from the descendants of the people who had defeated Abraham, who had freed Israel from Babylon, who had given the queen who protected Jewish survival inside the most powerful empire on earth. They brought 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh, kingship, divinity, and sacrifice. They did not know exactly what the child would become, but they were carrying, without fully understanding it, the most accurate summary of his identity and his purpose that anyone in that room would have been able to articulate. Persia's role in redemptive history was not finished at the decree of Cyrus. It sent witnesses to the moment the redemption of the world had arrived. But Scripture does not end with the Magi, and the rest of what it says about Persia is harder to hear. Ezekiel was a prophet who received his visions while living among the Jewish exiles in Babylon. His visions ranged from the immediate circumstances of his people to events so far in the future, but their fulfillment would require conditions that did not exist in any previous era. In chapters 38 and 39 of his book, Ezekiel describes a military coalition that rises against Israel in the final period of history. The coalition is identified by specific names, and the leader is a figure Ezekiel calls Gog, who rules over a region to the far north of Israel. Among the nations listed as members of this coalition, Ezekiel names Persia explicitly. The other coalition members are identified as Cush, which corresponds to the regions of Sudan and Ethiopia, Put, which corresponds to Libya, Beth Togarmah, which most scholars identify with regions in modern Turkey and the Caucasus, and Gomer, also associated with Turkey. When you map these ancient geographical names onto a modern atlas, a coalition takes shape that looks like a particular combination of nations that has not existed in that specific configuration before the modern era. Russia, or a major power from the Eurasian north. Iran, Turkey, Sudan, Libya. These nations have not historically been natural allies. Their religious traditions, political structures, and strategic interests have often placed them in competition with each other. Yet Ezekiel describes them acting in coordinated military movement, advancing toward Israel together. And the movement is described as being like a storm cloud covering the land. The language Ezekiel uses to describe this coalition's approach is specific. They will go up against the mountains of Israel. They will come against a people brought back from exile, now living securely in their own land. A people brought back from exile, living securely in their own land. This is a description that only fits Israel after 1948, and perhaps more precisely, after 1967. There was no period in Ezekiel's own lifetime, or for nearly 2,000 years afterward, when this description accurately described the situation in the land of Israel. The conditions Ezekiel described required a modern Israel to exist, and that is exactly what now exists. Persia, which once freed the Jewish people and allowed them to return to their land, is now named in prophecy as a participant in the military coalition that rises against them in the last days. The arc is complete. Elam versus Abraham in Genesis 14. Elam and Madai freeing Israel through Cyrus. Esther saving Israel inside Persia. The Magi from Persia honoring the Messiah. And now Persia, under its modern name, as part of the final confrontation. But what happens to that coalition? Ezekiel does not leave this part out. Ezekiel describes the response to this military coalition's advance with language that leaves no room for ambiguity. God himself intervenes. The text says that God will call for a sword against Gog throughout Israel's mountains. Every man's sword will turn against his brother. Then God will send disease, torrential rain, hailstones, fire, and sulfur against Gog and all his forces, and the many nations with him. Earthquakes so severe that mountains fall, walls collapse. Every person on the ground will be shaking from the force of the divine response. The coalition that advances does not succeed. Its military superiority, whatever form that takes, is neutralized by forces outside of military calculation. And the explicit purpose of this divine intervention, as Ezekiel records it, is not simply to protect Israel. It is to make God's identity known to the nations who have forgotten or denied it. God says through Ezekiel, "I will make myself known in the eyes of many nations, and they will know that I am the Lord." The Gog and Magog event, as it is called by scholars, is designed to function as a global announcement. Whatever nations are watching, whatever the international response to the conflict, the nature of what happens will be impossible to explain through military analysis or geopolitical calculation. Something will occur that forces a different kind of reckoning. And Persia, which is part of the coalition that advances, is part of the coalition that faces this divine response. The nation that once freed God's people, the nation that once protected them, the nation whose scholars followed a star to honor their Messiah. That same nation, in its final chapter as the Bible describes it, stands in the coalition that provokes God's direct intervention. How does this story end? The answer is where almost no one looks, because there is one more prophecy about Elam that most commentators never connect to this sequence, and it changes everything. The prophet Jeremiah received a specific message about Elam. This passage is in Jeremiah chapter 49. It begins with judgment. God declares that he will break the bow of Elam, the source of their military power. He will scatter Elam to every wind, to every corner of the earth. They will be dismayed before their enemies, driven out before those who seek their lives. The bow of Elam. In the ancient world, the archers of Elam were famous throughout the region. Their military reputation was built on this particular weapon. Breaking their bow was a way of saying their military strength was finished. This judgment, whenever it was specifically fulfilled in history, or whenever it still awaits fulfillment in the future, is clear Elam faces divine discipline. But then Jeremiah continues, and what comes next is the part that almost no one reads out loud in a discussion about Iran's biblical future. "In the latter days, I will restore the fortunes of Elam, declares the Lord." That is not a small statement. That is not a footnote. That is a promise, recorded in Scripture alongside the judgment, signed with the name of God. The latter days, the same time period Ezekiel describes when he places Persia in the Gog coalition, the same time horizon that Daniel's final visions were pointing toward. And in that same period, the same Jeremiah who announced judgment also announced that Elam's fortunes would be restored. This does not eliminate the judgment. It comes after it. It does not prevent the confrontation Ezekiel describes, but it means the confrontation is not the last word. God's final statement about Elam, about the land and people we now call Iran, is not destruction, it is restoration. This is the pattern that runs through the entire biblical narrative. Judgment is real, consequences are real, but the door is not permanently closed on any people or any nation that has been named in Scripture's promises. The prophets who announced the hardest things also consistently held open the possibility of a different ending for those willing to choose it. No other nation in the Bible, other than Israel itself, travels such a complete and specific journey through the pages of Scripture. Elam, in Genesis 14, the first military power to go to war against the people connected to God's promises, defeated by Abraham with 300 men. Elam and Madai, in the genealogy of Genesis 10, written into the table of nations before any empire existed. Their ancestors named, their future territory marked by the hand of God. Persia, in Isaiah's prophecy, a king named before his birth, assigned a task before his empire existed, fulfilling both within a margin of prophetic precision that has no parallel in ancient literature. Persia, in Daniel's visions, the silver empire, the raised bear, the ram with uneven horns. 3 separate visions from 3 separate occasions, all pointing to the same rising power before it reached its peak. Persia, in the decree of Cyrus the Liberator, the shepherd who said of Jerusalem, "Let it be rebuilt," and made it happen, just as Isaiah had said. Persia, in the story of Esther, the stage where a genocide was planned against God's people, where an orphan girl rose to the position that made her the only person capable of stopping it. where the decree designed for destruction became a day of survival. Persia and the identity of the Magi. The scholars who carried Daniel's calculations across the desert to honor a child. They could not fully explain who were the first outsiders to kneel before the one the prophets had been describing for centuries. Persia in Ezekiel's coalition, part of the military alliance that advances against Israel in the final days, that faces divine intervention, rather than Israeli military resistance. That becomes a vehicle for God to make himself known to the nations watching. Elam and Jeremiah's promise the nation under judgment, but with a restoration declaration still attached to its name in the latter days. No other nation has been named in this many prophetic contexts. No other nation's story in Scripture has this many turning points, this many reversals, this many chances. The nation that was once the instrument of Israel's liberation is now the nation whose military posture toward Israel makes international headlines every week. The nation that once freed God's people is now led by a government that openly calls for their elimination. This is a tension that Scripture anticipated, and Scripture also says it does not end with that tension as the final word. Here is the question to sit with after all of this. If the prophecies about Cyrus, written 150 years before his birth, came true exactly as written, if the prophecies Daniel received about the rise and fall of Persia came true in documented history, if Esther's story unfolded in exactly the city and exactly the empire that Scripture places it in, if scholars from the Persian tradition followed a calculation they likely inherited from Daniel to find the Messiah at exactly the right moment, if all of those things are true, and history confirms that they are, then what do we do with the prophecies that have not yet been fulfilled? The coalition Ezekiel describes is more recognizable today than it has been at any previous point in human history. The conditions that Jeremiah's restoration promise requires, judgment first, then restoration in the latter days, are conditions that fit the sequence of events Ezekiel places in that same time period. Iran dominates the headlines every week. The people making policy, issuing threats, negotiating, or walking away from negotiations do not know they are participants in a story that was written before any of them were born. But the story was written, and the final chapter is not finished. God bless you. See you in the next one.